Alright you guys, so as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out you guys, I've got another banger for you. And this story right here is another one of those stories that talks about all the common elements within that lifestyle that gives it one of them fascinating storylines. Prison, the Santa Barbara County Jail, phone taps, backstabbing, betrayal, homicide, deception, gang business, and the Mexican Mafia's taxation program. It hits on all the elements that you've heard me talk about in a lot of my other stories. And even though you would think that a lot of these stories begin to sound like more of the same, each one of these stories is unique in its own right and is predicated on a different set of circumstances with a different cast of people. And at least for myself, as someone who's been around this stuff both behind the walls and on the streets, and who has actually lived it, it never gets old or repetitive. Because again, some of these stories are so convoluted and have such a crazy twist to them that just when you thought you heard it all, they end up getting better. So without further ado, let's get into another one. So I'm going to take you guys back to 2018 when some of these events were just beginning to play out in Lancaster State Prison. And the circumstances about what was happening at that time were pretty simple. So let me try to put this in context for you guys so that it'll be a little easier for you to understand. So there was an individual by the name of Gregorio Augustine, who was also known as Damage from West Park. And apparently, according to one of my sources, who I'm now going to refer to as Stomper from City Terrace, Damage was not only a shot caller for his neighborhood West Park, but he had basically been given authority as a conduit over Santa Maria, Northern Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo counties. So with respects to his neighborhood, I don't know if he just had some influence based on the fact that he was working under the Mexican Mafia's direction on the streets, or if he was actually the leader of West Park that had nothing to do with prison politics. But either way, in 2012, he was in control of all of San Luis Obispo County, and part of his responsibility at that time was to collect the street taxes for the Mexican Mafia. All the street level dealers that were freelancing and selling their product in this area that the Mexican Mafia considered to be its territory were required to pay a set quota either weekly or monthly. These are called kickbacks, which in essence are distribution rights that the Mexican Mafia carefully and meticulously controls. The local Sureño street gangs in the San Luis Obispo County area that are also considered to fall under the Mexican Mafia's direction are also required to pay taxes on a weekly or monthly basis as well. Their purpose is defined a little different than the street dealer kickbacks, but these taxes are still mandatory. They're told it's for the greater purpose of the bigger cause, so that they can become self-solving and continue to break new ground. But again, this is all part of the smokescreen that most, if not all, these criminal organizations promote. You know, I've talked about this before as it pertains to the Nuestra Familia and how they push their tax program, but at the end of the day, the parallels are the same and the trickle-up effect works the same way. So again, it was Damage's responsibility to make his rounds and to collect these taxes from everyone who was dialed in. Once he had this money in hand, it was also his job to do the books, to basically keep track of all the money that was coming in and document the amounts and where it came from. In most cases, this money is micromanaged and carefully tracked by a figurehead that's usually in prison somewhere. It could be directly with the Mexican Mafia member that's in control of that area, or a secretary that he might appoint to manage the finances for him. Every member is different. Some like to be hands-on and do it themselves to minimize the hands it has to go through, while others will assign a buffer or a conduit to keep them insulated. In this case, Damage was in contact with Joseph Morales, who also went by Littles from Northwest, another Sureño street gang from San Luis Obispo County, who at one time was considered to be mortal enemies with West Park. However, with the influence of their individual roles behind them, Damage and Littles were able to broker a long-lasting peace treaty amongst these two neighborhoods. As far as Littles, he wasn't a member of the Mexican Mafia himself. However, he was appointed to act in the capacity of his position by Michael Moreno, Bubu from Norwalk, after another individual named Ulysses Guzman was relieved from his position. At that time, Bubu was in control of both Santa Barbara and Fresno counties until he was arrested in 2014. Littles held the status of what they referred to as a primo, and that's exactly what a primo was. Someone who's been given the blessings to work for a specific Mexican Mafia member, as a secretary, a buffer, a bookkeeper, or all the above. And it's basically a step away from being inducted or made if that's what that individual is ultimately working towards. So it was basically Little's responsibility to make sure that Damage collected all the MS street taxes in Northwest's territory as well in the rest of San Luis Obispo County. You know, I'm not sure if Littles and Damage had known each other before Littles went to prison. I don't think they did, but according to Stomper, they got real close during the time when they were communicating on the phone. Everything they were doing was orchestrated through burnout phones or contraband cell phones that had been smuggled in the Lancaster prison. Something else that Damage was also instrumental in himself. So Stomper said that they established a strong level of trust and confidence in each other, and that over time they became extremely close, which isn't a surprise based on the fact that they practically talked daily. In fact, on several different occasions, Damage even went to Little's family's house to drop off presents and other gifts during the holidays or when someone had a birthday. I don't think that I've ever heard of any universal policies that the Mexican Mafia implemented on its members or associates that have committed to working in one of its street crews, but the NF had street policies that actually promoted this type of interaction. So in the street policies that we were all required to follow in the early 90s, the regimental street commanders were encouraged to interact with each other's families and will also promote occasional get-togethers, barbecues, or family outings with the wives and kids. And the whole purpose was to promote the concept of family, which at that time the NF considered our personal families to be some of our purest reflections. So again, the only street policies that I remember seeing a Mexican Mafia member implement on the streets is when Arturo Castellanos, Tablas, from Florencia was doing it for his street crew. So following a federal RICO indictment that was unsealed on Florencia in August of 2024, law enforcement commenced to executing several search warrants that were all in conjunction with this investigation. And during one of these searches, investigators found a handwritten copy of these street policies taped underneath an end table in the house of one of these members. But again, these policies weren't a set of universal policies that were being implemented all over the streets. They were only being applied to Tablas' crew in his neighborhood, Florencia. So sometime in 2018, during one of their phone conversations, Littles advised Damage that there was an individual by the name of Javier Limon, who was also known as Hava, who he was apparently having ongoing issues with. So according to Littles, Hava was flat out refusing to pay his mandated street taxes after he was allowed to freelance in Northwest's territory. Believe it or not, this was a common problem that we used to encounter on the streets all the time. For the most part, the majority of people out there in the streets are going to comply and conform with the program by paying taxes when they're pressed, because they don't want to create those kind of problems for themselves in the streets with criminal organizations like the Mexican Mafia or the Nuestra Familia. So they just pay and avoid the conflict. But then you also run across individuals out there who for whatever reason refuse to pay taxes, and they buck back against the program. They think that they're either being punked if they comply, or they don't agree with prison politics and have a bad taste in their mouths when it comes to these criminal organizations. They look at them as interlopers, a bunch of dudes who put prison politics before tribal loyalty. And some of these cats feel strongly about this. But unfortunately for them, a lot of the time this ends up leading to their demise, because regardless of how it's dealt with, they can't be allowed to take up this position and get away with it. It just can't happen. So they end up becoming to be an example. In retrospect, I can still remember a handful of individuals who were all taken out because of this. And then it has a domino effect. Criminal indictments usually come next, followed by the loss of everyone involved. And then there's always a period of time where everyone on the streets is scrambling, trying to put everything back together. So Littles went on to tell Damage that this guy Hava was also claiming that he was already paying taxes to another one of their big homies, Robert Lopez, Toro from Santa Paula. But Littles ran this up the chain with Boo Boo from Norwalk and found out that this was a bold-faced lie, which in itself is considered to be a serious misrepresentation. Most of the time when you run into individuals like this who use a reputable name like Toros, someone who's an active member of the Mexican Mafia, to collect tax money for themselves, this is called name dropping. And anytime you use a member's name in vain and misrepresent something you're trying to do for yourself is an offense that's punishable by death. The Mexican Mafia takes this very serious, and a lot of people have lost their lives for doing this. Because what you're basically doing is stealing from them, and that's what Hava was doing. He was required to pay taxes like everyone else, but for whatever reason, he decided to play a dangerous game that would end up catching up with him. So Hava wasn't what you consider to be a hardcore gangbanger. He did his thing out there in the streets, but he just wasn't into it like that. He was considered to be more of a baller. He drove around in a Lincoln Continental with some 24-inch blinged out Lexani Aries rims. He had gold rings on all of his fingers, and he was just a flamboyant D-boy type. And this is another reason why they stayed on him, because they knew he had money and he was pushing a lot of weight. In fact, Littles would sometimes go through him to get his D. But business is business, and this didn't give him a hall pass not to pay what he owed. So Littles had other members of his street crew press Hava about this, but Hava continued to lie and insist that he was already on the books with Toro. I don't know what he was thinking, because he had to have known that they were going to follow up on this by asking Toro. But maybe he thought he could create just enough confusion to buy him some time, and that by the time that they did, he'd already be long gone. Nothing else makes sense to me, unless he's just a reckless dude who liked playing with fire. So once Littles got confirmation that Hava wasn't paying taxes to Toro, that's when the complete smut job was put on him, and he basically became open game for propaganda. I say propaganda because I don't know if it was false propaganda or if there was something Littles actually ended up finding out about. But Littles told Damage that he thought Hava might be working with the cops and that he was an informant. And I believe he told him that to make the target on his back bigger than it already was. Because the contempt and disgust for someone who's broken the rules and got themselves caught up politically is a lot different from the contempt and disgust someone would feel about someone who's working with law enforcement. And I'm sure Littles knew this. Stomper, on the other hand, couldn't confirm this one way or the other. But this is exactly how these types of situations play out. When someone has you in their sights and you become a target, this is when they start fabricating and adding in all the extras. Again, I don't know if this is what Littles was doing, but it sure seemed like it. Because prior to Hava getting himself in hot water by not paying his kickback taxes and lying about being on the books with Toro, Littles was copying from this guy and everything was all good. But the minute he turned on him, now he's a rat, he's working with the cops, and he's a grimy dude. So Littles basically tells Damage that he wants Hava whacked and that he wants him taken out. And Damage understood exactly what this meant. Nobody's running around with tomahawks or pea shooters on the streets. And that's the difference between someone getting hit behind the walls and someone getting hit on the streets. Although recently this does seem to have changed. When you put a green light on someone in prison, it isn't always going to necessarily result in the target losing his life. Sometimes he'll get poked a few times, sliced, and he'll live to talk about it. But like I said, it really just all depends, because now removals behind the walls are going back to the old school way. People are getting murked all the time. They're losing their lives almost daily. But on the streets, it's definitely different. You have access to real weapons out here, so the chances of someone losing their life when they're green lighted out here on the streets is always going to be greater. So when Littles conveyed this to Damage, Damage understood this to mean sending this guy to Brazil, that he wanted him X'd out and eliminated. Damage, on the other hand, told him that he'd take care of it ASAP and not to worry about it, that he was on it. So after this conversation took place, Damage started to formulate a plan and go through all the details for taking out Hava. And Littles had given Damage Hava's number so he could call him and arrange to meet him. But Hava wasn't answering his number. He didn't answer numbers that he didn't recognize, and him and Damage didn't know each other. So this created a temporary snag. So at that point, Damage started doing the only other thing he could do. He started looking for him in the streets. Littles, however, became more proactive about setting this up because he wanted Hava taken out. And he wanted to prove to Boo Boo that he was more than capable of not only taking care of something like this, but also orchestrating it as well. So Littles called Hava and told him that his boy Damage was going to be calling him and to do him a favor, that he was going to be needing something and that what he was going to pick up was for him. And based on their past business dealings, Hava knew that he was talking about D. Because remember, whenever they were trying to get Glavo smuggled into Lancaster, Littles used to have his go-betweens caught from Hava all the time. So the following day when Damage called Littles, Littles told him that he had just spoken to Hava and that he was expecting his call. Littles then tells Damage about the context of their conversation and that this guy's already set up, hook, line, and sinker. Littles says verbatim, all you have to do is tell him that you need to pick up some H and then act like you're going to make a transaction. And then when you see him, take care of it, you know? So according to Stomper, Damage didn't have any problem spilling blood or meting out different forms of violence when he had to. But Damage still asked Littles about something, and it was a valid question. He asked him, why don't your homeboys deal with this dude? Meaning his homeboys from his neighborhood, Northwest. And Littles' response was an honest one. He said, man, unfortunately they ain't built like that. I love my homies, but they just ain't putting it down like that. Littles then went on to tell Damage that this was coming from up top anyway, basically indicating that this hit was being ordered by the Mexican Mafia. So later that same day, Damage called one of his boys, Brian Rios, who also goes by Shadow, and basically asked him for his assistance in dealing with an issue he was having. And Shadow was somebody that Damage trusted like a brother. He knew he could depend on him for anything, especially something like this. And the reason why he knew that is because according to what would come out later in the case, Shadow had participated in another homicide with Damage, and he was also a previous co-defendant with him in another case, and Shadow held his mug. So sometime in August of 2014, Damage arranged a fake drug transaction with Hava under the pretense of buying a large amount of H that Hava was also led to believe was supposed to be going to Little's and their big homies in Lancaster. And this was all said to legitimize the ruse and to basically keep Hava's mind at ease. So from that point, the trap was set, and now it was just a matter of meeting Hava where him and Damage would arrange to meet. But what ended up happening next technically should have spooked everyone and foiled the whole plan. So originally, Damage was supposed to ride solo and do this by himself, which definitely would have been better considering what ended up happening later. But then he decided to bring his boy Shadow, someone who he knew he could trust. And then on the night of the incident, when Shadow picked up Damage in his white Mustang, this is when he found out that Shadow decided to bring another one of his boys along with him that he also trusted, Arturo Granados, who was also known as Artie. You know, they might as well have just brought the whole neighborhood along and made this one big family affair. I mean, these guys acted like they were going grocery shopping or to the local mall, inviting other people that they didn't need. And it's not to say that Artie wasn't a solid dude or that he couldn't be trusted, but this is another one of those situations that should have been on a need-to-know basis. They were going to whack this guy and catch a body, so this was starting to become a little reckless. And Damage was obviously feeling the pressure of having this other guy with him that Shadow didn't tell him nothing about. And later he would admit that he felt uneasy about it, so much so that he actually came up with an excuse to pull out at the last minute. But Damage did it in a way that wouldn't cause Shadow or his homeboy to look at him sideways. He told Shadow that he needed him to co-pilot this arrangement and to make sure that it got done because he had to go take care of something that was extremely important. You know, on a side note, I've got to say this. You know, Damage and Shadow must have really trusted each other because for Damage to pull out when he did, the way he did, should have raised some serious red flags. And it should have also made him and his boy abort the mission as well. But apparently, that didn't happen. You know, Shadow and his boy were so focused on the fact that this was a Mexican Mafia hit that they were oblivious to everything else. So Shadow ended up dropping Damage off, and then they continued to the prearranged meeting location that Hava and Damage agreed to meet at. A place called Rancho Guadalupe Dunes on the 6900 block of Main Street. And this is when things almost went left. When they pulled up to this place that's commonly called the Dunes, Hava was already there waiting. And according to what Stomper said, Hava had no reason to believe he was in any kind of trouble, so he wasn't tripping. But later in the case, it will come out that Hava looked spooked when he didn't see Damage and instead two other guys that he didn't know. So from there, everything kind of escalated fast. Both of these guys were strapped, and apparently the plan was to go something like this. Shadow would take more of a lead role and feed Hava some bullshit reason about why Damage couldn't be there. At that point, once he set Hava's mind at ease, when he was ready, he'd catch him slipping and he'd be the first one to pump some bullets into his body. At least Shadow had the sense of mind to do this as a coordinated effort so that they didn't just pull their guns out and start shooting all crazy, where somebody could potentially get hit by crossfire. And that's basically how it all played out with the exception of a few minor differences. So when they pulled up, after Hava got past not seeing Damage, he walked up to the car and shook Shadow's hand through the open passenger side window. Then on his own accord, Hava got in the car so that they could talk business, and that's when things eventually went bad for Hava. And here's the thing, neither Shadow or Artie cooperated, so initially nobody knew exactly what happened, but later the details would end up coming to light after Artie confided in one of his cellmates at the Santa Barbara County Jail. But what was known at that point was that Hava was shot 10 times during this meetup. And after being shot 10 times with two different guns, a .22 caliber handgun and a 9mm handgun, Hava died right there on the spot. His heart, his liver, his lungs, and his kidneys were all perforated with bullets. You know, it was definitely overkill. But again, these guys were turned up and focused on the fact that this hit was being carried out for the Mexican Mafia and that they'd be recognized for taking part in it. So after Hava was eliminated and it was official, Shadow called Damage and he basically let him know that it had been taken care of. And even though Damage wasn't there while this was carried out, he still sent a message to Littles advising them that Hava was fertilizing the dunes. So this is where the story takes a crazy turn and the plot just continues to thicken. Not just for Damage and Littles, but for everyone else that was involved and implicated as well. So after Shadow and Artie took Hava out that night, Artie enlisted the help of his sister, Yesenia Granados, who was also known as Senya, to assist them with destroying and getting rid of some of the evidence. Their clothes, the weapons, possible DNA and trace evidence, anything that might have been left behind. Needless to say, Hava's body was found in a culvert about a week later alongside the road near the entrance of the Guadalupe Dunes by a group of farm workers in the early morning hours of August 19, 2014. And because his body was already showing signs of decomposition and he had sustained so many gunshots, he was barely recognizable. The coroner had to identify him through fingerprints and dental records. So a few weeks after Hava was taken out, Damage was arrested for possession of ammunition and narcotics. And initially things didn't look so bad, but the homicide detectives that were investigating Hava's homicide had information and reason to believe that Damage might have been involved, and they kept the pressure on. During the first 2 weeks while he was incarcerated at the Santa Barbara County Jail, these homicide detectives came up and questioned him several times about his possible involvement, and they apparently managed to get in his head. Because after initially denying any involvement or knowledge about it and claiming that he didn't even know who Hava was, Damage finally folded and went for the banana in the tailpipe. He fell for their scare tactics. They threw out just enough to get into his mind and make him believe that they already had the evidence that they needed. In actuality, they really had nothing linking him to this homicide with the exception of confidential information indicative that he might have been behind it. He wasn't even there, but because they got him to talk and implicate Shadow, Artie, and Littles, now they had a case not only against him, but everyone else as well. And Damage told them everything. He gave everything up. He told them that Littles was working under Boo Boo from Norwalk, and that Boo Boo gave Littles his blessings to collect Mexican Mafia taxes in Santa Maria, Northern Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo counties. He also told homicide investigators the intricate details that led to Hava's homicide and everyone who was involved. And then the final piece that Damage gave them that would also go bad for Littles is that Littles' girlfriend, Josie Alejandre, was also his main point of contact that coordinated all the Mexican Mafia street taxes, and that she was also the main communications hub. This led to the investigators approaching Josie and telling her that if she didn't cooperate with their investigation, that she'd not only get shipped off to prison, but that they'd also take her kids as well, something that they always do. A lot of the times when they run across women like this that are being utilized to facilitate criminal communications, they go right at their weakest point of defense, their kids. They threaten to take the kids, and Josie was no different. So after they threatened to take her kids and they led her to believe that she was in a lot of trouble, she ultimately decided to cooperate and she agreed to set up Littles. So at that point, they gave her a recording device with instructions on how to elicit specific questions that they wanted her to ask him. The next time he called, unfortunately for Littles, the betrayal just continued to come from a number of different directions and things just kept getting worse. But things ended up getting worse for his girlfriend Josie too. Because despite the fact that she cooperated and gave Littles up, things didn't go exactly how she wanted them to go either. They ended up doing her dirty, because later prosecutors pointed out that her agreement required for her to be truthful and to refrain from participating in any and all criminal activity. However, prosecutors would later claim that she continued to avoid their phone calls and that she also continued to sell and use drugs during the entire time that the case was being prosecuted. So in the end, 5 people ended up getting arrested and implicated in Hava's homicide. Brian Rio, Shadow, Arturo Granados, Artie, Gregorio Augustine, Damage, Yesenia Granados, Senya, and Joseph Morales, Littles, were all arrested and charged. But it didn't stop there. These guys made some of the same mistakes that you've heard me talk about in some of my other stories. They get to the Santa Barbara County Jail, one of the worst places you could make the mistake of talking about the details of your case, and they confided in other inmates about what happened. Inmates that would end up contacting the homicide detectives and telling them everything that they were told about Hava's homicide. I understand how people could make this mistake when they find themselves in this kind of bad position. They just want somebody to talk to so that they can tell them how they're being railroaded and how they got put in a bad situation. But the county jail isn't a place where you can find that kind of trust in people, and it definitely ain't the place where you can find some moral support when you need it. There's people in there who are trying to find their way back home, and they'll do it any way they can, even if it means burning someone else up to save themselves. In fact, during the trial, they brought in a former inmate named Ernest Gill, who also goes by Big Stretch. Big Stretch was celled up with Artie at the Santa Barbara County Jail and testified about conversations him and Artie had regarding Hava's homicide. The conversations weren't recorded, but they still centered on the circumstances that detailed how Hava was taken out, who was involved, and why it happened. And Artie apparently believed that he could trust this guy Big Stretch, because he even told him that Damage was the one that said that Hava had to go and that this was a sanctioned hit by the Mexican Mafia. Big Stretch also testified that Artie talked about Littles, who was incarcerated in Lancaster State Prison, and that another high-ranking Santa Barbara gang member, Ruben Regalado's name, who they called Evil, also came up. And then finally, the other thing that he also testified about that was devastating to all the defendants in the case were some of the intricate details surrounding Hava's homicide. Stretch said that Artie told him that when they pulled up to the dunes, that Hava made the fatal mistake of getting in Shadow's Mustang with them. At that point, they took his cell phone, pointed their guns at him, and locked all the car's doors. As soon as the car stopped at the farm fields, Hava got out of the car and took off running. I don't know how they let him do that when they had him at gunpoint, but obviously he took off like a bat out of hell. Artie said that they actually even lost him for a few minutes, but eventually they found him hiding behind a power pole before they ended up finishing him off. None of these details were initially known until this guy Big Stretch came forward and told law enforcement, because like I said earlier, neither Shadow or Artie cooperated. All this came out later, and only because Artie was talking about things that he had no business talking about. And this is exactly why these types of things are supposed to be kept on a need-to-know basis. There was no reason why Artie should have been privy about these things because they didn't involve him. But because he was exposed to it, he then started to talk to someone else about it. And as you can see, it was then leaked out and disseminated in this case. So anyways, fast forward to sometime around 2019 when this case ended up going to trial. Damage was already burnt up and was considered to be no good. So he decided to do everything that he could to help himself, which also included testifying and turning state's evidence. But here's the crazy thing that ended up happening during trial. Littles felt like he was being railroaded and that a lot of the evidence that was being used against him was either being taken out of context or that the case was being completely fabricated. And he felt like he would be doing himself a huge injustice if he just sat there with his hands tied and not be allowed to defend himself. So he decided to testify at his own trial and defend himself against all the evidence that was being improperly used against him. And he understood that testifying, even at his own trial, clearly goes against the rules, and that by doing this, he was putting his own life at risk. But in his mind, there was no way around it, because by agreeing to testify meant that he would be forced to talk about things that could potentially get him in trouble. Things like Mexican Mafia business. On the other hand, if he didn't defend himself against the fabricated evidence that just kept mounting against him, he knew without a doubt that he was definitely going to get buried. And he was absolutely right. Him testifying in this case, whether the evidence was being embellished or not, put him in the Mexican Mafia's crosshairs. You could say he was done and ready to be moved to a protective custody tier after the first day of him testifying. There was no way he would have been given a pass or he would have been allowed to talk about some of the things that he did. Unfortunately, that's all part of being active and being involved in that lifestyle. When someone lies or fabricates evidence or a story about you in court, you don't have the liberty to respond to it or to refute it in any way, shape, or form. This comes with the territory, and you're basically expected to sit there and accept it. I mean, you can fight it in legal terms, but you have clear limitations, and there's just things that you can't say or talk about. You have to accept the lies and all the things that are being fabricated, no matter how bad it gets. Littles, on the other hand, decided he wasn't going to do that. So after sitting there and listening to Damage testify about the things that weren't completely accurate and things that he said to minimize his own role, Littles said, "I'm not just going to sit here and watch this fool do a frame job on me and say nothing about it." So again, he decided to fight his case and testify on his own behalf. But like I said, this came at a steep price. He had to give up his career within that lifestyle and separate himself from all the things that he was once loyal to. But testifying on his own behalf wasn't exactly a cakewalk that went in his favor either. The prosecutor that was prosecuting this case was already of the mindset that Littles was nothing more than a master manipulator, and that's exactly what this case was all about. That he used a contraband cell phone to orchestrate and streamline Hava's homicide. And then when Littles agreed to testify, this gave the prosecutor a first-hand look into the mentality and psyche of Littles' mind. The prosecutor would later say he attempted to manipulate on the stand just as he did to the detectives. The polite, soft-spoken demeanor is the face he put on for the detectives. He's a pathological liar, and his testimony couldn't convict a jaywalking ticket, let alone a special circumstances homicide case. So in the end, after deliberating for a short period of time, the jury ended up convicting Littles for second-degree homicide, and they also found the special criminal street gang and firearm allegations to be true. As a result, the trial court sentenced Littles to an additional 55 years to life on top of the prison sentence that he was already serving. Damage was sentenced to a 25-year life prison sentence for his cooperation and testimony against Littles, which wasn't much of a deal if you ask me. He would have been better off fighting his case and taking what they would have gave him. 50 to life or 75 to life isn't much difference than 25 to life. That life tail usually means the same thing, regardless of what numbers are before it. Arturo Granados, Artie, pled guilty to second-degree homicide, homicide by torture, homicide with immediate flight, with special gang enhancements, and was sentenced to 19 years in state prison. Brian Rios, Shadow, pled guilty to second-degree homicide, homicide by torture, homicide with immediate flight, with special gang enhancements, and was sentenced to 15 years in state prison. Yesenia Granados, Senya, was sentenced to 5 years in state prison for accessory after the fact and disposing of evidence. Anyways, like the majority of these cases turn out, this one was no different. In the end, there was no winners. Everybody that was involved went to prison, and Hava's family ended up losing a son, a father, a brother, and a loved one, all behind this guy not paying his kickback taxes. I wonder how many of these individuals are sitting in prison right now regretting that they got involved or that they made some of the choices that they made. For what? So that they could lose 5, 15, 19, 25, or 55 years or more of their lives? And that's considering that these guys don't do a day longer than what they were sentenced to. Years that they can't get back. It's a foolish game. But unfortunately for them, it takes something as sinister as this, being involved in a case like this, to make them realize how precious their time really is on this planet. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, then give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. And again, something else that's extremely important that I'm going to continue to keep reminding you guys about is to not only hit the like, drop a comment, and share the video, but also hit the all symbol on the notification bell so that you're advised whenever I drop content on the channel. So with that being said, as always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and for also continuing to tap into the channel. In the meantime, you guys enjoy the rest of your day and keep pushing that positivity. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.